Hey everybody, it's Bust with our 2023 year in review video series for the Legends of Runeterra. And so, if you want to hear our thoughts on the champions over the course of the past season, that's previous video. If you want to hear our thoughts on the competitive scene, that will be the next one. But the mechanics are what we're going to be touching on in this video. So the new keywords, the new themes, the new text added to stuff, rotation and the like, that's what we're going to be covering off on this one. And so to kick things off, we have the coin, the new card type added within the Glory in Navori, and I was having very mixed emotions when this card was initially spoiled. On the one side of the coin, if you will, there's a lot of stuff I really like about this kind of ability. It's a generated card, so the Attentive Accountant attacks, you strike, you get a coin in hand. You can do all kinds of stuff with those generated cards, right? You can discard it to a rummage. You can use it to, say, level up your Victor. You can use it to level up your Seraphine. There's just like a lot of things that can kind of come into these generated cards that give side value that doesn't necessarily just tie into that main mechanic, whether or not that's like Set and Showstoppers or Jack and Mad Ol' Babs doing stuff with mana refill, or if it's even the big, what is it, like Knuckle, Truckle, and Buckle combo, whatever that like 16, 18 mana worth of units that nobody plays is called. Like it doesn't have to necessarily just tied directly into the main mechanic. I like that aspect of it quite a lot. But on the flip side, you have to worry about what are people able to do if they have access to 15 mana in a turn, 18 mana in a turn. Do you run into these spots to where the coin is able to allow a turn to where you play like Riptide Rex and a Condense and a second Riptide Rex and the game just immediately ends? And that Miracle Rogue style of coin play never really came about. If you want to consider Karma to be in that camp, I don't necessarily agree, but I do understand it, and I think that it worked out quite nicely that way, as in terms of that big Miracle Rogue, big OTK style of thing just never happening. But as we did mention Karma, I don't know whether or not the devs realized what they were getting themselves into with the Karma coin, and to a lesser extent, Seraphine with the coin, and doubling the coin and making multiple copies of it and the like, and getting just an absolute massive amount of mana back. And at the end of the day, from a gameplay perspective, from a pure power level perspective, I don't think that Karma set with the coins was too powerful. I just didn't like the fact that you could run into a lot of these games to where it's turn 11 and your opponent absolutely should be winning the game, but they can't win the game right now. They can't actually win the game for another 5 turns. And so you have to sit through this nonsense to where, do you want to be held hostage in this game for 5 more minutes and 5 more turns because you have a 2% chance to win? Or do you just want to go ahead and hit the concede button and move on to the next game, give up in a space to where you could have potentially come back to victory? And so I didn't like that aspect of it. It's not really the coin's fault, but I think that was really the only kind of downside to the Karma set piece to me. But nonetheless, I'm curious to see if we have any more kind of interaction in the future with the coin. I feel like Karma Set is going to make that say no. It doesn't feel like it's the kind. It feels like the kind of mechanic that could come back because it's very general, just in naming and what it does. But I feel like with that kind of dirty taste that Karma left all over the card, that it's probably not going to make its way back, which to me is a bit unfortunate. I think there's a lot of kind of very interesting things that you can do with this, whether or not it's kind of the mini ramps or the kind of discard themes that we alluded to, activating stuff off the generated cards. There's just like a lot of neat things that can happen with these that we don't, probably get to use anymore because Karma came out and ruined it for everyone. But nonetheless, a reasonable mechanic. I think it was fun for the people that like doing this kind of thing. Up next, we have Brash. I think Brash was very well executed. I think this is very strong, and I love seeing stuff like this come about. To me, the thing that was interesting with Brash is that it gets stronger just through the natural progressions of the game, right? It was clearly and obviously very strong with like flipped Nylas, right? So you give all your team Brash, your flipped Nyla attacks, it AoEs the entire opposing team, and they just can't block because all of their units lost health. Like that thing is neat. That's cool that interaction comes about. But to me, the thing that was ultimately quite interesting with Brash is if you just want to say, think of a unit like Loyal Badger Bear, right? Loyal Badger Bear gets into combat. It's a 4/4, so it's probably going to take a couple of turns to take down. So it gets into combat with your 3/3 and survives. Now that the Loyal Badger Bear is only a 4/1, it's not able to block a Brash unit. And so just throughout the natural course of the game, the Brash keyword got a little bit stronger. And so I think that, everything all tied together made it very neat. It was something that happens on its own. You can something, activate it with your spells so you can Mystic Shot something so maybe it can't block, whatever. There's a lot of cool concepts that kind of come out of this. And I think it's also very important and strong to have combat oriented champions have a way to elusive, overwhelm, or rally. And so having that bit of evasiveness that comes out of Brash can make these champions that cost 6 and 7 mana much more combat relevant. So it's not like, oh, cool, I just played my Volibear blocked, right? You don't run into that nearly as much when you're able to attach one of these more fair keywords to a champion, right? You're not getting as much combat effectiveness from Brash as you would from Overwhelm or Elusive, but as we can see with Nasus, right, it's still very relevant having these combat keywords, even though it's not the top tier of the keywords. And so after Brash, not necessarily mechanic, but one of the most influential, if not the most influential things on the game over the course of the past year, the rotation. And I love rotation. I'm all for it. I'm all about it. I think it's great in multiple ways. Number one, you have the Calling Strike Soul Harvest on the screen here that lets you kind of fix some of the color pie issues from days of old, right? Calling Strike, not really a Noxus theme. Taking that out of standard and then attaching it back into the game as Soul Harvest, very nice and strong there. Also gives you the opportunity to rotate out cards that may have been mistakes, whatever it was. It's not Mage Seeker Jr., it's that P&Z card that generates 5-cost spells and make them cost 2. We got to play with that guy for like 2 months and then it was just removed from the game. Fine, get rid of that nonsense as fast as possible. It's great there. And then it also gives the chance for the new champions to shine or to potentially bring back an old one since we are rotating things away, not based on the chronological timeline, if you will. I think this was all big and good and well. And so I understand it's a bit unfortunate if your favorite champion got taken out of standard. That is a fairly feels bad moment, but for the overall health of the game, it's a must-do thing, and it's very important. Also, on the topic of rotation and to a degree as well, balance patches, I think that Legends of Runeterra is in a very interesting space. Being in a game that is essentially free to play, you have a lot more options in terms of rotation and balance patches and changes, at least in my opinion, right? If you look at a game like Magic, it has like 2 problems with it. Number one, in the sense if you alter a card or ban a card or remove a card from a format, there is a very big monetary attachment that can be attached to that, right? I remember back in the space to where Jace the Mind Sculptor was just the best card in the game. It cost about $150 a piece, and Wizards of the Coast had to make the decision if they're going to ban Jace monetarily, in the sense that it's not a card that should be within the format. It's way too strong. You can't errata the card because it's a piece of paper, but are you now going to ban out $600 of cards from thousands and thousands of people? Just legitimately saying your $600 is now worth like $15 is a real consideration that they have to stop and make. And so, that kind of sucks for Magic. We aren't playing that game, so who cares? Moving into the space of Hearthstone, that same kind of idea still applies, right? Hearthstone is a very expensive game to get into. I feel like with every set of Hearthstone, it used to cost me around $250, $300 to get all of the cards. And then if you're going to make that big monetary investment and then have the cards change, that can backfire and leaves a lot of feels bad moments if the money you spent to purchase a wild card, to purchase a legendary or whatever, now gets taken away from you. It doesn't feel very good. But in the space of Legends of Runeterra, that doesn't really exist, right? It can to a degree. If you paid $10 for a skin for your favorite champion, then that champion changes to be no good. You're probably not using that skin anymore. But outside of that kind of thing, it's a very low cost investment monetarily to get into this game. And I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to just do massive, massive changes across the board. And so I personally always shoot for bigger changes. I wish the balance patches would be bigger. I wish the changes coming out of the variety patches would be bigger. And I'm hoping that we also see a pretty big change come with the upcoming rotation that's probably happening here in the course of a couple of months. And so we'll see how that plays out. I like seeing the big things happen, and I think that that's a space to where Runeterra is at a very good spot to where there shouldn't be as much feels bad moments in terms of at least money if the cards have to come out and be changed. After that, though, we come into the heart of the Huntress with the ambush mechanic. Now, I do want to talk about both ambush and disguise a little bit together because it's kind of tough for me in the sense that like the ambush mechanic is fine, right? I don't think anyone had too many feels bad moments with this. It's something that can be expanded on in the future, right? Some Bilgewater bro running around in the sewer or some PNZ bro hanging out in the sewer, whatever they do, right? You jump out of the sewer vent and get into combat somewhere. You can easily take ambush elsewhere. Just the surprise factor of a unit doesn't have to be locked into the Nidalee kit. And so it does have that going for it. But there's a very big information overload kind of opportunity for this style of thing to where it's fun and interesting to kind of play into ambush and figure out the various permutations of what your opponent's trying to do to where it then becomes information overload and you just say, fuck it, right? You know, just say, like, all right, I don't care anymore. It's too much thinking to do. I'm just going to cast Mystic Shot. And so that is one of the problems you run into. I felt like Ambush was in a pretty good space, given that there were usually only like 4 or 5 relevant cards, right? There was the 3/1 that passes out vulnerable. There was Nidalee. There was the dude that has the spell shield that counterspells stuff, and then there might be one more card after that. And those are the only ones you really had to stop and consider. But if you have to sit around and stop and consider like 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 different cards, then that stops being fun for anyone, and you really hit kind of a brick wall in terms of the thought you're willing to do. And then you just say, fuck it, Mystic Shot, right? And so I think it was in a good space. I'm curious to see if this branches out into other factions or into more cards. I do really, 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 really love that you're able to right click an ambush unit and it just shows all of the possibilities. That's one of the things that worries me about this mechanic really being something that could be pushed on into the future if you have to show 25 different cards because that's everything within the ambush kit, then that loses, you know, a lot of the appeal. But I think it's very well done. Even though the mechanic in the Nidalee kit was really just Valley of Imitation over the course of the past year. That same kind of thing ties in a little bit to Disguise, right? We only see Disguise on Nidalee, but I could definitely see other units come down with this ability, and I don't feel like Nidalee really took that like massive amount of thought to you know try and have the maximum good plays going with her, right? And so she was, you know, really kind of intent on there being, you know, 15 different units in your deck, and it would be much more challenging to figure out which card was actually Nico. It was, you know, much more challenging to actually play Nico as a unit in your deck as the disguise, but that's the kind of interesting and fun mini game coming across for both players. And so I think that this went fine as well. I wasn't much of a Nico enjoyer. I just didn't like a lot of the decks, so I didn't play a ton of these abilities. But, you know, this does strike me as something that could be moved into something else, and is mechanically something that could work for other shapeshiftery style of units. And so, you know, not good, not bad, right in the middle there, if you will. Moving forward, though, we do have Siren Song is one that I'm going to bring up. And this isn't like a new mechanic or anything, but I did like the idea of kind of enhancing champions and kits of old as variety patches come out and new sets come out. It gives you that new and kind of fresh look on cards of old. And while, you know, Siren Song was probably one of the most hated cards of the year and probably in the least liked meta by the majority of the crowd over the course of the year, I do like seeing, okay, we're going to bring something back for the Evelyn kit, right? So we're going to add in Siren Song. And then Siren Song was quite interesting. And then it does work with a bunch of other themes and abilities, right? As we saw over the course of the year, it wasn't just the Husk decks using this, right? You got this paired into Bilgewater for the 1-drops matter kind of decks, and using it with Fizz and the 4-mana landmark, whatever it was called. And then you found a bunch of other different decks that were quite happy to be using Siren Song, be it something like the Poro King. You know, the options were there. And so to me, this was like a very interesting and very well designed card. In the sense that it works in the kit that you're looking to attach it to, but then it also has interesting fringe uses elsewhere. It was just a bit unfortunate for a lot of people that this costing 4 mana was just one of the strongest cards ever printed. So a bit of a whoopsies there. But as we can see with like Balin the Benevolent kind of revitalizing Formidables, it's just so interesting having like one card pop up. You know, as we have a new Frostbite card come about for Ash, or if we have a new card come out for whatever champion. I really like using the variety sets, or if it's, you know, this was a Bilgewater card in a set that didn't involve much Bilgewater, still a way to give that faction a really big infusion of interesting, if you will, even though it's not the main focus of the set. After that, we're moving into Fate's Voyage Onward. The updraft mechanic, I'm pretty whatever about. I don't think there was anything particularly special about it. I'm really curious how much of the Janna kit would still be played if updraft wasn't even a thing, right? It was always nice to be able to cheat the mana, but you know, for a lot of the times, it was just not so much the updraft that mattered as much you were just drawing 1,000 cards every game. But I guess you can't play the 1,000 cards if they don't get cheapened somehow. But nonetheless, I wish that there was kind of more to it, more places to explore. It's in like a really tough spot, and I think Dedicant of the Challenge hits like both sides of what I'm about to talk about, in the sense that shuffling cards away is a humongous downside, right? Having cards in hand and drawing cards is always the kind of resource thing you're looking to chase down in the course of card gaming, and taking that away has to get a big payoff right back. And so getting that mana cheapening is nice, but if we're just discarding cards away and then naturally trying to make them come back, you have to be getting some kind of big upside out of that. Now, the Janna kit dealt with that fairly easily, right? Everything within the Janna kit just drew a bunch of cards, and so pretty much every single card you updrafted away, you immediately replaced. It was a lot of just direct comparison to being discard stuff, right? And so is Mariam better than a Zonite Urchin, right? That's a very easy kind of comparison to think about, since you can discard a card and draw a card, or you can updraft a card and draw a card. And then the same things with the Janna kit. The rest of them all just drew more cards, right? If you have Janna, she updrafts 2 to draw 2. If you have the Sunken Temple, you updraft your hand, and then you get to draw an additional card on the next turn. And so the places to where this didn't really hit were cards like Dedicant of the Challenge. It's a very tough place to balance. How good should this be if I'm not getting back equal or more cards out of the thing? And so, you know, I think the Dedicant of the Challenge has some interesting spots to it, right? You can cast him with Jinx on board to immediately empty your hand. You could say hit Dedicant with Mordekaiser as a way to just draw some cards if your hand's empty. Mordekaiser doesn't feel like the perfect example because you probably have 7 cards in your hand at the time, but that kind of thing of like cycling through the Dedicant of the Challenge is very interesting. If you have a recall thing with him, right, you can cast him again, get a bunch of extra card draws out of him. But there are going to be those games to where you have to say updraft 4 cards away to only draw 2. And does that really make up for it? The times that are good, does it make up for it when the times that are bad? And you just don't really see that in the Dedicant. And so it's tough to tell with updraft. Like, it's a mechanic that if we just didn't see it ever again, I don't think anyone would really care. Like, I don't think over the course of all my time interacting with my YouTube viewers and people on Discord and people on Twitter that anyone has ever been like, oh man, if updraft gets taken out of the game, I'm going to be so mad. But it does have some interesting design aspects to it, as you look to say tying it into Janna with reduced cost cards, right? And so there can be some tie in that way. It's just at the end of the day, like if you aren't giving that card draw back, if it's just a complete card loss instead of a card cycle, you have to be getting some kind of big advantage out of that. And it's not to say there isn't something in the future that couldn't make up for that, but Dedicant of the Challenge was the really only thing out there, and he most certainly didn't get the job done. After that, we're going to talk about 2 cards kind of back to back again. We have Titanic along with Elementals. And to me, Titanic is executed beautifully. This isn't anything new to the game. This is just kind of a simplification of words, right? So if you look at Seismic Shard that's on the screen, it has both Behold and Titanic. Instead of saying, if you have a card in hand or on board that has 8 or more attacker health, I cost 3 less. Like, once you've played the game a few times, it's much easier to quickly understand what Behold a Titanic unit means. Really cleans up a lot of the text. It makes it easier to understand. It makes it easier to talk about. And then it can have some other kind of similar tie-ins without just taking up a monstrous amount of text on the card. To me, that's very straightforward and good when it comes to things like Titanic. Like if you want to think in the space of magic and reach, right? That's what Omen Hawk does now. Omen Hawk says, I can block a unit if it has elusive. That's what reach is in magic. Magic says you can block a creature with flying. That's the same thing as reach. Like I really like that kind of tie-in that makes it easy to figure out. Now, where that doesn't really appeal to me is with something like elementals. Now, elementals has seen a lot of interesting usage over the course of the past year, be it with things like the elephant, be it with the new set with the various boons and the targeting. Like there's a lot of interesting things that tie in with elementals, but now we're in this space of two different questions, right? So next year, as the new cards are produced, some new pyromancer magey style of unit comes out that throws fireballs or throws lightning bolts or throws ice shards or whatever. Does every single card that unit produces now have to have the elemental subtype? And if it doesn't, why not? Right? And so why does Annie's fireball thing count as an elemental ability? And then the next, who's it going to be? It's not Victor. I'm trying to think of who another fireball slinger would be, but it's not coming off the top of my head. Why isn't that one an elemental? And if it is, does that start like tying in differently with the keywords and stuff? If you want your new fireball slinger to have some kind of other keyword, do we have enough space to make it, infernal and elemental? And so I don't entirely like that this has just been such a broad strokes mechanic, right? So to me, it's very easy with Titanic, right? This is just not an actual keyword. This is just uh, a word shortener, if you will, a sentence shortener, taking 8 words and combining them down into one, as to where elemental is a actual legitimate keyword. This isn't just describing some fireball looking thing. This is having like legitimate effects on spells and skills throughout the course of the game. And I just feel like this is probably too broad. And so I'm curious to see how Riot handles this going in the future. If it's going to be okay. I mean, I'm sure it's just okay to say this new ice-based mechanic is not an elemental ability, but it just feels like something that has to be taken into consideration for the future history of the game, and that's just like way much to tie into a single keyword. And so I think that it'll turn out fine. I'd say what we're going to have happen is that elemental is just forgotten, but I feel like it's just too broad and too big. Now, it's not to say the mechanic wasn't fun. I enjoyed a lot of the aspects of the elemental mechanics. The elemental elephant was quite good. Using Escalia with the boons has been kind of interesting. There's a lot of great things to me that came out of elemental. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm not saying it was executed poorly. I just worry towards the future how this is going to be handled, and I just hope it's kind of like, eh, we forgot about it. We're not doing that anymore. We're not applying this to literally every single card in the future. After that, we have what I think is the biggest upside, the biggest win in terms of competitive gameplay across the course of the year, and that is the Explorers package. These just do so much in terms of limiting decks that should be degenerate, say like the Bandle Tree, while being good enough against the decks that have cards you need to stop. And so if a deck like Bandle Tree rises up, you have the opportunity to bring the shutdowns. It should never be the absolute best deck in the format when you're able to play Explorers and take it down. And so that aspect is good. But then as you kind of move down the quality chain in terms of the landmarks, if you think that Sunken Temple is too good, you have answers to it now. If you think Talia Lysandra is too strong, you have some answers to it now. But these answers tend to be not strong in the sense that they completely just end the game, right? I played tons of Jax Orn over the course of the past year. The Explorers were not enough to stop anything Jax Orn was doing. I feel like if Talia Lysandra was a big thing now, or if Talia Malphite was a thing, these would be nice stumbling blocks, right? These would be ways to bring shutdowns to it. but it's not enough to completely eliminate it from the game. And so I think they worked absolutely fantastically that way. They work nicely to shut down some of the big OTK decks. They work nicely to shut down things like Spell Shield. And then they have that ability tied to it, as we were talking about with the coins, as to where these are generated abilities. And so you have the discard aspect to it. If we're discarding these cards to rummage, we can updraft these things away. You can use it to activate your Seraphine. You can use it to activate your Victor. You can use it to activate your Augment. There are just like so many things that get tied into these cards. That they just feel like complete wins across the board. Yet at no point over the course of the past season have they felt too overpowered. Like it's been incredible to me how good these things are, and then also incredible they don't see nearly as much play as they should. It has this kind of like interesting meta aspect to the explorers, to where you don't want to play the explorers if you don't have to, and so you want other people in the meta to be playing the explorers, right? So if you're playing the sunken, or if you're trying to counter the sunken temple deck, you want sunken temple to be removed from the meta because everybody else is playing explorers and you're specifically not playing them. And so I think what you get is Reddit just doesn't play them, and then Twitter plays too many, and then it all just kind of balances itself out in the middle. It's just very interesting and very well done. I think these are probably, to me, some of the highlights of the year. After that, we can move into the final set, the Fate's Voyage Beyond. Up front, we have the Dragon Boons. And with these, I'm kind of interested in what happens with them. I vaguely understand what's happening with this from League of Legends. The Elder Dragon and the various buff boosting things weren't really in the game when I was playing, and so I'm not certain what all they tie into now, but it strikes me as something you could tie into other units, right? Maybe if you add Baron Nashor to the game, he gets to deliver Dragon Boons. That sounds legitimate, right? But are the various drakes in the game, like Cloud Drake is one of the drakes that passes out these things? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just going to be Elder Dragon centric. But if it's something that gets generated by other units after the Elder Dragon, I think that would be kind of interesting. As far as the mechanic right now goes, I think most of it's kind of okay. I think that the thing that feels kind of bad is probably just the Deathless keyword, in the sense that having units like Saiyan Thousand Tailed, having units like with any of these kind of comes into play abilities, and Deathless is extremely powerful. And so you do run into a touch of a high roll aspect, as to where I've played my Saiyan Thousand Tailed and I missed Deathless. Like, is that going to be a game ender for me? Or I've added my Lord Broadmane to the board. He didn't hit Deathless. Is that going to be the end of the game to me? Like, there's just a very big spectrum of which units want specific keywords. And if you miss out on the right keyword, you end up losing the game because of that. And it hasn't felt too bad, but there's definitely been times when that turns up. And it definitely feels like Deathless is the one to where your opponent just goes, oops, I'll win, right? And so I'm curious to see if anything comes of these changes. As far as like balance-wise goes with the boons, the only thing that I really suspected would happen is the double impact is going to go to single impact. But to me, the big problem point, the big pain point here is the Deathless keyword. And so up next, we have the curses. Very divisive right now in terms of the curses, especially tied around suppression. But I'll say up front, I feel like all of the curses are very well balanced right now. I don't think suppression generates any kind of feels good moments, but I think the prices you have to pay for suppression, the price for Ichor, the price for Shackles, all feels pretty good. And so I think this has been, a bit of a win. It's an interesting space that gets generated within the games in terms of playing around the curses and developing your mana and spending mana in ways that works with these, and then kind of ignoring some of your units until later in the game. Like, there's very interesting play patterns. The only thing that I don't like about suppression is it says that you can't do something. And I feel like if this was in the space to where you had some kind of agency to it, to where my thought was, if suppression costs 0 mana, and then it said all of your spells cost 2 more mana, then you could still, say, play Vengeance for 10 mana, and you don't have that feels bad moment where you just can't actually do anything. You can still play your 10 mana spell, but after playing your spell for 10 mana, you still have that suppression in your hand. So you're going to have to play an additional 4 mana just to get rid of it, or you're going to have to pay 8 mana to play your next spell and then get rid of suppression. So it really adds up. And the majority of the time, I think that they're functionally the same, but it doesn't have that you cannot do this aspect to it, which, the focus speed stuff does bring some interesting gameplay, cursing your opponent at the end of the turn, rolling into your turn and knowing that you're just safe. But I feel like that's the only kind of real miss with suppression. You get a little bit of that feel with Shackles, but I think Shackles is interesting in the sense to where if your opponent, say, Shackles your Seraphine, she still does Seraphine stuff, not attacking, right? Or if your opponent Shackles your Victor, he still gets to play his augment things and eventually flip and stuff. He's not completely removed from the game. He's, his combat monstrosity is certainly toned down, but he still gets to come out and do stuff. And so I think that's one of the more interesting thing with Shackles. I think the combat one that's actually the most interesting, even though it sees literally zero play, is the -3 attack one. It does, a similar thing to what I would like to see out of Shackles, to where the unit isn't combat effective, but it's not completely removed from the game. But at the end of the day, I think these are all, balanced mana wise. I just don't think suppression is fun. That's how it is. But the other kind of interesting thing with curses is I wonder if there's going to be a space with them like with boons and traps, right? So boon became a keyword, and that's what chimes are, and that's what portals are. Traps are the negative effects that get shuffled into your opposing deck, like puff caps and flashbang traps. I'm curious if we're going to see that kind of space with these curses, as to where additional curses will be made in the future. It's just the kind of card that gets shoved into your opponent's hand, takes up some space, and gives them a negative effect until they discard it. And then on the flip side, if we're going to see positive curses, right, something that gets added to your own hand, has something to it to where it gets like a cost reduction every turn, and then once the cost hits 0, it just goes away, but it gives your unit some kind of positive boost or something. I don't know. But I think that this space of adding cards to your opponent's hand to give them a negative effect is beautiful. And it's one of the things that I really love about digital card games, right? You can't really do this kind of thing within a game of Magic. It's very, very odd and awkward if you start taking cards and adding them to your opponent's hand and adding them to your opponent's deck. But it's all a go within the digital space. And I'm curious to see if Riot does anything more with these. All right, after curses, we do have Deathless. It's interesting what we've seen with Deathless. The Deathless units, rarely seen, if at all. The only Deathless unit is the 4/2 that passes Deathless out. We don't even see any of the Noxus spell that passes out Deathless. Indestructible, I believe it's called. The actual biggest source of Deathless that we have in this set is the Elder Dragon. And now, whether or not that was intentional, whether or not that was planned, I'm not quite certain, but that's certainly just the way that it's actually played out and the way that it is. The other big thing that we're seeing with Deathless that kind of ties into the not fun camp is the reusage of the Mage Seeker Inquisitor, putting those suppression curses into the opposing hand. Now, outside of all of that degenerate nonsense, like that to me is the downside of Deathless. On the upside, it's a mechanic that I feel like should feel pretty good to us. It's something that these revive aspects spend multiple ways throughout the actual game League of Legends, whether or not that's a champion that kind of like dies and comes back in the way of Zillion or whatnot. I think there's a lot of interesting ways to take advantage of Deathless that way thematically. But also just attaching these protective elements to any of your units is pretty good. If you have one big important unit that you want on the board, having this sort of guaranteed way to keep that unit around can be very interesting and powerful, and it feels like 3 mana is a good price for that kind of thing. You do just kind of run into these spaces to where the units on summon do get a bit degenerate. With your Saiyan Thousand Tailed getting Deathless or whatnot, it can be a bit overpowered in that sense. And it does open up that space to where you have to consider if every single unit in the game now has access to a resummon. Is that going to be too much? And so, as far as Deathless in the future goes, I don't expect we're going to see too much more of it. I'm sure there's going to be some equipment and some spells in the future that do have it, but I feel like it's going to be much more focused in on like singular ideas, like this champion has Deathless, and when this champion Deathlesses, he flips and comes back or something, as opposed to just grant a unit in your hand Deathless. I feel like that was probably a bit of a miss. It seems like a keyword to me that should be very focused in whatever is executing it. some kind of, necromancy or some kind of champion ability, as opposed to just say put Deathless on this unit with summon and use it a bunch of times. That doesn't have a ton of flavor to it. I don't know who runs the flavor department, who writes the lore stories, but I bet Saiyan Thousand Tailed with Deathless was not really at the top of the at the top of the lore generation, and so. Again, it just strikes me as something that is too generalized in the current sense. Last but not least, the final one we have cannot be stopped. Now, I personally have not attacked with a flipped Elder Dragon. I feel like over the course of the Fates Voyage Beyond, I've had one situation where an opponent could have one, and I messed it up and they got to flip it and attack and win. And then there were, as mentioned 100 times on the World's broadcast, 0 flipped Elder Dragons throughout the course of the event. And so to me, the peak cannot be stopped was Riot Dirtle posting his Twitter thread explaining what it cannot be stopped mean. That should be a classic in the course of Runeterra history. But as far as the actual game itself goes, it's kind of is what it is. It's just that meme from before the set came out was much bigger than what you saw once we had it out on release. And so maybe we'll see Cannot Be Stopped again. I highly doubt that we do. I hope it only sticks to the Elder Dragon forever, and that bright moment from the pre-release season could just be what the memory entails. And so that is it. That is our coverage of the mechanics from 2023. Agree, disagree, or did I miss something? Be sure to let me know. Love to hear it down in the comments. And then that is going to do it for us today. So if everyone enjoyed the video, hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way and had a good time watching. This is Bust, and we thank you for being here.